Kia ora and good morning, everyone. I had the best intentions of getting here last night, but had a share milker meeting and over a contract, and I just wonder if everyone here realises how hard it is to find a share milker that can take you through a transition of a conventional farm through to biological or regenerative system into organics. So we're negotiating a package to hold on to this person because he's part of the future for one of the farms that I sit on. So look, I'll get straight into this and push the right button here. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a quick overview, very quick overview of the findings of a research program that was funded by the NZAGRC starting 2014 to 2017. And one of the findings of that was that farm systems changes on their own weren't enough. Right? They were a step in the right direction, but if you're looking at the entire farm and the entire farm system, the property, there needed to be diversification in there. And so a lot of the discussions and the modelling that we did with the farmers that we were working with was how do we make changes that fit inside the frameworks, the mental frameworks and the values that they have for their farm properties. Just so happens that every one of these, the focus of this was on Maori farms, Maori incorporations and trusts, and other structures. And one of the things that came through the research was that we were dealing with quite a different group of farmers. Right, we call them Maori farmers, but they were representatives of landowners that sat on trusts, ahu whenua trusts under the Ture Whenua Act. They were sitting on as board members and corporations, but they were also on limited liability companies that had land returned to them under settlement. There was also family-owned, run farms on Māori land that were part of the research as well. And what came through really strongly was that we were talking to not just farmers. Right? These were people that had a deep relationship, genealogical relationship with the land, and their discussions were about doing the right thing. Right? Looking at investment into change, and in some cases looking at options that were quite hard to make if you just looked at it from a narrow point of view of the financial impact on the farm. But when you broaden that to their role as kaitiaki, or guardians, we call them tohunga kaitiaki, the group of guardians that, the group of stewards that guard the land for future generations. So the decisions that they made and the process that they went through and the discussions that we had was in a much wider context. So what I'm going to do in this session is just take you through the context of what we call Māori farmers. The first slide up here is around the structures. And I'm putting this up because many of you will have heard the statement, and it's been around for some time now, that 80% of Māori land is underutilised. So what you see here are a list of structures that administer the land. There's been research done recently in the last 5 years that shows that around 80% of Māori land, and that's the current stock take is around 1.7 million hectares. About 80% of that is in what you would call a utilised category, from pastoral farms, indigenous forestry, exotic forestry, horticulture, etc. That's 80% of it. Now you could say that they were some of them were underperforming, but that's the profile of the entire industry, isn't it? You're always going to have a long tail of farmers that could do better. And there is land in different parts of the country that owners on land that could have other choices in the land utilisation and the land use. So that's that first point, that not all Māori land is underutilised. There's usually some kind of ownership structure that sits on top of it. Over the last, up until very recently, most of Māori farmers were trusts and corporations. And we've got some examples here. Top left is Ātio Whanganui. It's one of the largest land areas, or largest incorporations in land area, around about 46,000 hectares. Paranini ki Waitotara in Taranaki, a large land-owning entity there with dairy interests. Waipapa Trust in the northern shores of Lake Taupo. But one of the changes that's happening is the increase in post-settlement entities that have come into the landscape. So a couple of examples here. Pa Kihiroa is the land that came back to Ngāti Porou under settlement, and on that is Mount Hikurangi. So they're a very well-run farming organisation. And on the other side is Ngāi Tahu farming, that needs no introduction to those of you here. But what's still happening is that redress is still continuing to happen. So in the far north, this group here, they formed a collective of 11 farms. Some of those farms, about half of the 11 that are there, have come back under settlement, but they've also got incorporations and trusts. And these collectives are going to be more common. You'll see more of them around the country. This one is 16,000 hectares and 85,000 stock units. And it is, I just want you to take a note of that, because this is the way of the future. You're going to see more Māori collectives having a bigger say in not only in shaping the industry, but also having an input into policy. So very quickly, with the research that we did, starting back in 2014, we had a profile of, it was 30 farms. He ended up with 29, and they were a range of organisations. We then went down to 4 case study farms. And I want to acknowledge Te Tumu Pairo, the Māori trustee. 2 of the farms were theirs. And then we had 2 others, one in the far north and another one on the east coast. And again, those conversations that we had with them were around, well, how do you design a landscape that fits the objectives? And they had a wide range of objectives. And so mitigation options, dropping stocking rates, changing your fertiliser regime, reducing stocking numbers, were all part of the mix. But alongside that was, well, what's the landscape going to look like? Where can we do other things with the land? So we used a modelling framework. It was based on a spatial platform. It was My Land, and that's still in the slide there, but that's morphed into another framework now. So Gerald, you'll be pleased to know that My Land is not completely forgotten, but it has moved into another program. But it's around understanding if you're going to change a farm system, and one of those objectives is to reduce the footprint of the farm, reducing cow numbers onto a smaller land area, and then doing other things like forestry or horticulture. What does that look like? So to do that, we had to run FarmX and Overseer, and I've been working with Phil Janot and Ag First on this since 2014. And some of the, I'm not going to go into many of much of the detail on this, but when we looked at options and we weighed them up against their objectives, what we found was that some of the options looked good when you discussed them in terms of a farm systems option, but when you ran it through Overseer and FarmX, you then got the relativity between the profitability and the emissions. We also looked at the crossover point there, so that if for a dairy farm, if they did nothing with no mitigations and the price continued to increase, what would be that point? If they had diversified into forestry, what would be the carbon point at that point, where the profitability of forestry and carbon equaled the on-farm profitability of dairy? And in this case, it was $23 a tonne. And the early modelling, we used between $10 and $20 a tonne. So this was all information that we'd put in front of them. And then in this instance here, we looked at this, we worked with this trust that, in the far north. They were really interested in rejigging their beef operation. Where we arrived at was that once we put the carbon sequestration into the mix, they made the decision to reduce their beef footprint, but run it in a more intensive production system. And the higher revenue from that and the higher gas emissions were offset by forestry planting. They had some forestry there, but the neutral point was 80 hectares. They decided that they would put in 30 hectares to start with and run a 200 hectare intensive beef finishing program. So this was about putting options to them, but they took it within the wider business. They also decided that they would increase Mānuka planting in there and indigenous planting. So the entire landscape of the farm changed along with the production system. Our second phase of research is looking at this question around farm diversification. If the end game is for farmers and catchments and groups of farmers to be more diversified in their operations, moving away from a single product producer into multiple producers, we wanted to work with a couple of organisations that were already diversified, and they'd been on this diversification track for 20 years. And these two, one was Te Oranga B2 Incorporation, and that's one of the oldest entities in the country, formed in 1910 under the one of the earliest farming entities, but also a Maori organisation. The other one is the Onuku Trust, just outside of Rotorua. Both of them have got dairy farms. They've both got mixed livestock. They've got investments into exotic forestry and indigenous forestry. One of them is looking at dairy sheep. Another one's looking at diversifying into tree crops. They've got a number of enterprises, and they're interested in, one, how do they extend those? What else could they do? And when we did the modelling, they were interested in what that looked like going forward. And what we wanted to understand was that trajectory that they'd been on for 20, and in some cases, much longer than that. So a couple of points here around Maori land and its structure. And I just want to, I've been in this game for a little while, as some of you will know, and there are a large number of myths out there around the capacity and the capability of Maori land. This is from Te Arawa, where I'm from. It's a group of farming entities and corporations and trusts. There are 34 members. Some of them are very, very large agribusiness organisations, and some are smaller. The total number of members is around 55, but there are 34 financial members in it. So it's the largest farming collective, or largest Maori farming collective in the country. And this group, this collective, has been analysing itself for some time to understand its profile and where they could go as a group. One of the conclusions out of not only analysing the land within the collective, but also beyond its borders into the wider tribal area, is that a small number of organisations control the majority of the land, right? And these are larger incorporations and trusts. And so you've got, it's the 80-20 rule, and it's very similar to the profile that we see nationally. You have a smaller number that are prepared to invest in change, a smaller number that have got the capacity to reconfigure themselves, but because they're representative of a wider group of landowners, there are smaller land blocks, some of them that don't have any organisational or management structure, that are linked into them. They're linked in tribally to them. So this is a network of farms that share very similar values when it comes to making choices. Is that 2 minutes? 5? Okay. I won't take that long, Mark. This is a kind of along the same theme, that around no management structures and a lack of capability. So I think for those of you out there that are looking to partner and work with Maori in this space of greenhouse gases, pastoral greenhouse gases, carbon, and also the related area, which is fresh water. All right, so we've got a refresh going on now with fresh water. There's a lot of overlap in the recommendations, the recommended changes that need to happen on farm, right? And all of the modelling that Phil and I have done on these farms has looked at both the gases as well as nutrient leaching. And there are similarities in it, as many of you would know here. So the conversation needs to be broader than just greenhouse gases. It's around environmental stewardship and environmental responsibilities. And so finally, this is my last slide. I know that the title in the program was Challenges for Maori, but I want to turn that around. And I think that going forward, Maori agribusiness has a structure about it, an ethic about it, and a set of values, right, that can assist in reshaping not only the government policy but also the industry in this country. And this is the primary industry in its widest sense, not just the agricultural sector, in its widest sense. So the first is to understand that in the Maori world, farmers are custodians. They're kaitiaki. You need to make the decisions that are not only the right thing to balance the social outcomes, the economic outcomes, and the environmental priorities, but also that you're making decisions and you're making investments for future generations. There's a willingness to invest in environmental protection and social benefits because of that balancing fact. And future generations is, for Maori, and I sit on a number of boards in my spare time. For Maori, your legacy is what you will be judged on. It's your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, right? The decisions that you make today. And so every one of us that sit on these boards making decisions around, hopefully the right decisions to move in the right direction, given the framework that we live in, that we exist in now. It's around, putting yourself forward, projecting yourself forward 3 to 5 generations and saying, well, how will I be judged? All right? By not only my future generations, is that it? 2 minutes. All right. I'm on track. So it's around projecting yourself forward, doing the right thing. The collectives, there are more and more collectives, Māori collectives that are coming together now. They don't just form and exist in catchments, they're multiple catchments, right? And some of them go across multiple regions, right? We need farmer groups that can come together, right? Really talk about what's important, what you value, and what you're prepared to do to change what you're doing now, right? And finally, the last point there is around partnering. We need to partner among ourselves and across sectors, across the entire community. I've been with Scion now for 4 years, and one of the things that we're looking at there is the value chain, right? Putting in place options for farmers if they're going to move from a primarily single product producer of meat or wool, or milk, into being a multiple enterprise. And that might include forestry, might include both exotic forestry and indigenous forestry and horticulture, but understanding what the value chains look like. Because those of us that are farmers in here will know that it's too easy for experts to say that you should be doing this. And when the two questions that you ask as a farmer is, what does it do to my system, my entire system, and what's the viability of those options? Right. And one of the key points around viability is to be able to look through a value chain. If the value chain doesn't exist right now, and a lot of the changes that are needed, now we are talking about new products and new value chains that have not been, they might have been thought of, but they're not in place now. Right. And farmers need to be part of that visioning and that journey. So I'll leave it there, Mark. Thanks, everyone.